Okay, so I'm gonna refresh, and we should be zoomed halfway out, halfway in, whatever you want to consider it. Okay, so we got more of a gradient. Um, Something about this does look a little bit suspicious though, because it's a 512 by 512 data set. I was expecting to see a little bit more, um, a few more lines. So I think I may have screwed something up here. So let's do a 512 by 512. And then, okay, no, that looks correct, but why is, um, 256, 512 would be half of that. 512. Okay, so like now on screen when I do 512, right, I get all these lines, and that's correct, right? That's what I expect. It's just it seems to zoom in more than I expect with the values I use. So I'm gonna just chop off a little bit of this. I'm gonna do like a 500. And then I'm gonna go back here and I'm gonna refresh. Okay, so I saw a little bit of those lines kind of stretched out a little bit. So that's the kind of the effect I was expecting. I'm gonna keep on tweaking the code off screen and refreshing, and so we can see what it's looking like. So I'm at 500, so I'm gonna try like 480. Okay, yeah, that's kind of what I expect. 444. Let's try that. Let's refresh. Zoom it in more. Okay, let's try 400. 400. All right, and then let's try 380. Yeah, try 380. Okay, let's try 300. Okay, yeah, so with that, with it looking as it is, this is correct, right? I thought it was wrong at first glance, but no, this is 280 right here. So obviously if we use something as small as 64, hold on. Obviously, we're going to refresh. So yeah, using something like 64, yeah, you don't really get any gradation. And that's what I was talking about. Like if you zoom into the edge of a circle, if you zoom in enough, right, that curve starts to look like a line. And that's kind of the effect we're getting here, where you can't see any traces of the gradient once you've zoomed in enough. And so you're like, oh man, that doesn't look quite right. But actually, no, we're spot on. We got this. So let's keep it at like I don't know, 440 or something. I don't know. Let me refresh. Something where it looks zoomed in now. Let's try 400. Something where it looks zoomed in, but let's try 350. Where it looks zoomed in, but not too zoomed in. Yeah, that looks good right there. Okay, so what do we have here? We have the same like viewport sampling from the last piece of code I wrote yesterday, but now we're kind of like sampling from a bitmap that's off screen. That's what we kind of have here. The next thing we want to do is we want to kind of letterbox this, right? We want to make it so that this destination viewport, anything outside of this viewport, we just want to draw black, right? So let's do that. So in the do mapping function, we could probably change that, right? I think we're gonna have to like refactor and rename some things after we're done here, because I think some of this code is kind of getting kind of ugly and hacky. But you know, you got to concentrate on one thing at a time. So we're gonna concentrate on getting it working and getting it to like a good kind of like checkpoint. And then once we're satisfied with that checkpoint that we've accomplished, then we'll go clean up some stuff. Okay, so the do mapping function. Okay, so we see this little comment here, iterate over each pixel of the viewport. So really what we want is to iterate over like every single pixel of the canvas. And if we happen to be inside of the viewport, then we do all of this dx, dy sampling kind of code. So, okay, first thing we can do is we can add the check. This check is gonna seem kind of like, what the hell is the point? Because it's not gonna make any sense yet, because we're kind of in the middle of refactoring, and as you refactor, sometimes code just doesn't make sense. So if this dx is greater than or equal to dx0, or actually, you know what I like to do? Let's do this. Let me think. Now let's just write it the way that makes sense. So, so if dx is greater than or equal to the lower bound, and then if dx is less than or equal to the upper bound, and then same thing with the y's. So dy, and then greater than blah, 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 y's, zeros and ones. And then we can make little comments here. So this is going to be left, and then we want to be within the right bounds as well. And then we want to be below the top, but we want to be above the bottom. Okay, right, and then, so this is my hacky way of kind of like writing an or statement. So if, not an or, sorry, an and statement. So if this, and this, and this, and this. And it's just a way where I can like keep everything nice and lined up, and I don't know, it's just my way to do things. You might absolutely hate this. Okay. So if all these conditions are met, which they should always be met because we're iterating through the viewport, then we want to do all this setting logic. So we're going to say like, you know, it would actually be, we're going to say var inside, and then it is the inside destination viewport. Yeah, I usually don't equals true. You know, I don't usually make long variable names now, do I? But if it's something I don't think I'm going to reuse a whole bunch, then I make it like a longer name. Because I'm not planning on reusing it. So inside destination viewport, we're going to set it to false, and then if all of these conditions are met, we'll set it to true. And if inside destination viewport, you know what, I'm going to say outside. I'm going to name that to outside. Equals true, and then false. We're going to flip this like that. Okay. And the reason I'm flipping it like that is so that if you're outside, we can have the pixel setting code for setting a black pixel is going to be a relatively little code. So I can write that little bit of code here and then have all the big chunk of code like down here. And that's because if we have like a little chunk of code, sorry, if we have a little, so we have these two blocks here, right? We have this chunk of code, and then we have this chunk of code. Since this is the smaller chunk of code, having it first is going to make it easier to not miss the two blocks of code, right? Because this is big, so we're absolutely not going to miss this big chunk of code. But since this is a small chunk of code, if it was a small chunk of code, on the other side. So if we did like something like this, where it's the big chunk of code and then it's else small chunk of code, it can make it, sorry, so we have this small chunk of code at the end. So we start here, big chunk of code, scroll down, small chunk of code down here. It can be easier to miss that chunk of code. So I prefer to kind of have it ordered like this, because we're not going to miss this chunk of code because that's big. And then for the small, setting the black color, we can do that here. So right now I'm just going to put a throw OOB, and that's because the way I've written this, it's iterating through everything in the viewport, so we should never get this case yet, and we'll solve that later. So let's go back to here and refresh, make sure that everything looks the same. Nothing should have changed. Okay, so everything looks the same. I'm going to stop recording and record again.